Pavlovsk. It's Catherine's fortress, I think, in Pushkin Square. It'll be fun.
A very long one. It's actually the longest of the city. It has 8 kilometers long. That's about 5-something miles long, and it goes all around the southern part of St. Petersburg, so it is called the Circular Canal. And it was dug in the mid-19th century because they always were trying to somehow deal with the problem of the floods. It was a really very bad problem here. In general, in the northern countries, the level of water in the rivers rises mostly in spring because of the ice melting. But it doesn't happen in the Neva because Neva flows from a huge lake called Ladoga, as you maybe know. Ladoga Lake is the largest of Europe, the biggest one. Actually, it's like a sea because when you stand on one shore, you don't see the opposite. And so, because of the scale, because of the volume of water it has, the seasons actually don't matter to this lake, neither in autumn nor in spring. Even when the ice melts, the level of water does not change significantly in the lake. So it doesn't influence the level of water in the river. But on the opposite, in autumn, not in spring, the floods did happen in the first 3 centuries of the history of St. Petersburg because of the wind bringing excessive water from the Baltic Sea. Because part of the Baltic Sea, the Gulf of Finland, that's nearby St. Petersburg, is very shallow. So when the wind is strong, a lot of water comes from the so-called long wave. Excessive water brought by the long wave comes into the Gulf of Finland, getting it flooded very quickly, and then as this water doesn't have anywhere else to go, it all enters the Neva. And Neva is very short, quite a short river according to Russian standards. It's only about 50 miles long, 74 kilometers. So it also gets flooded immediately because of the wind in autumn. And the first 3 centuries of the history of the sea. Here, by the way, to the left of us is one of the so-called triumphal gates or triumphal arches of St. Petersburg. They were put in occasion of some important victories of the country. This one specifically was built in 1830s to commemorate the victories of Russia over Poland, Persia, and Turkey. And it was the biggest cast iron construction of its epoch because it consists of many parts that can be disassembled if necessary, and that was really done after the World War II, after 1945. For several years it was disassembled by order of Stalin because he didn't want to have in the city any reminders of any other victories that Russia had except the last one over the Hitler's Germany, and he wanted to be the only one hero of the country. And then later, after he died, that was in 1953, under the next communist leader of the country, the leader of the government, Nikita Khrushchev, this triumphal gate, that's called the Moscow Gate, was put back on its historical place. Why Moscow? Because it stands in the southern part of the city. So it's called the Moscow Gate because the troops were returning into St. Petersburg through this arch coming from the southern areas of Russia and from Moscow, from the southern theaters of the war, and because Turkey, for example, is to the south of us, of course. So they were returning actually from the conquest of the Black Sea, the Crimean Peninsula, the northern shore of the Black Sea. If you look to your left, you see a big park. This is like the official entrance into it. There's 2 yellow colonnades, and it's called Park of the Victory. Such parks were made in all the big cities of the Soviet Union just after the war, and they all were called Parks of the Victory. And around us here we have a lot of Stalinist architecture, except one round pavilion here. This is of the 1980s. This is one of the departments of the public library, Russian National Library, sorry. And to the left is one of the most significant examples we have here in St. Petersburg of the typical Stalin's Empire style. It was built for the functionaries of the Communist Party of Leningrad, let's say for the members of the government. So, as you know, in the World War II, the original project of Hitler was to conquer Russia very quickly, because he already knew the story of Napoleon, that probably the biggest problem he had here, well, besides the strong resistance of the population, of course, was the severe Russian winter. So, having this information, Hitler wanted to finish it all before the first strong freezes would come, like by November. And in general, for the rest of the world, you know that the World War II started in 1939 when they entered the territory of Poland. So for us it was on the 22nd of June of 1941 when they entered the territory of the Soviet Union. And they entered from Poland, so the first republics of the Soviet Union that they occupied were today's independent countries, the so-called Baltic republics, Latvia, Lithuania and Estonia. And they passed them quite quickly, they passed them through because a lot of Latvians, Lithuanians and Estonians, they were very anti-Soviet politically perspective. And so they actually joined the Hitler's troops, helping them to pass this area very quickly, because they actually preferred to be under Germans than under Russians. And by the 8th of September, they were already near Leningrad. They were also planning Soviets. It was built in the 1930s. Actually, it miraculously was not destroyed by bombardments. This is one of the very few buildings here in the south that was built before the World War II, not after it. And there in the 1930s, as the historical center was still regularly flooded, there existed a project to move the administration of the city to the south, farther from the rivers, from the big rivers and the Gulf of Finland. So actually they were planning to move the bodies of the local government, Soviets as they were called, into this building. That's why it was called the Palace of the Soviets. And but because of the World War II, this project was not realized. And this building was occupied by different governmental institutions, not the government itself though. And now it has nothing to do with the administration. It just has offices of private companies, so let's say it's a huge business center, but still it bears the coat of arms of the Soviet Union on top of the roof, sickle and hammer. And in front of it is the statue that we call Lenin calling for a taxi. It's one of the few monuments to Lenin that still have not been taken away, probably because they consider it like architectural, cultural, sculptural heritage, whatever, I don't know. In the Soviet era, the communist propaganda, of course, was much more, you could see a lot of, much more symbols of the regime, especially of the story of Lenin. In the city there were a lot of monuments, his busts, his full body sculptures, a lot of memorial plaques on the houses saying here he lived like a couple of months, here he had some friends, here he visited a girlfriend, here he drank a cup of coffee, and here he visited the toilet, etc. And most of them were taken away after the perestroika, after 1991. And to the left of us here is a monument to the sieged Leningrad. You see, it's a red granite circle that is broken just behind us now. You see in front of the obelisk that and these are the sculptural groups that represent the defenders of Leningrad. So the circle symbolizes the German troops, the circle of the Germans that surrounded the whole city. So this was what what I started to tell you about Hitler's original plan of conquering the Soviet Union, called Blitzkrieg in German. That means quick war. it faced some problems here in Leningrad because they could not conquer the city. Because even the kids, like 12, 11-year-old kids, also took part in the defense, although they could hardly sustain a gun, but still they took part in the resistance. And the Germans never entered Leningrad, and then Hitler changed his plan and decided to surround the city with its troops and just wait for the people to lose patience and just to surrender, just to surrender. And so the siege lasted for almost 3 years, or exactly 872 days, and that was one of the most terrible period in our history, because, as you understand, the city was surrounded by the enemies. There was no supply of food, pure water, or medicines or whatever from out there. And of course the people ate quite quickly all the reservations of food they had in the city, and they also started to eat, they ate all the domestic animals, then they started to eat straw animals, they ate birds, they would cook soups or leather belts or wallpaper because it contained glue, and there even was cannibalism, although the police was trying to control it as much as they could. But of course in the sieged city some people would go mad of hunger, and they would better lose their life than stay one more day without eating. So there would happen some very terrible stories. And the siege, actually during the siege, more people in St. Petersburg died of starvation and of freezes than of the real military defense of Leningrad. Because also by a tragic coincidence, the first winter of the siege of 1941-42 was one of the coldest winters during the whole meteorological observations here in Leningrad. The freezes came down to 39 degrees below 0 Celsius. That's really very, very cold. And so the city lost about 30% of its population. That's 1.5 million people. And of course, all this about the memory of the siege is very important for us. We have a lot of monuments in the city reminding the people of that period, because almost in any family you have some grandparents or great-grandparents or some relatives who stayed here during the siege, who died here or whatever. So it really touches almost every family here in St. Petersburg. And we are now like in a relatively modern area. Good. So this is Pavlovsk Palace. You see it's very modest as we compare it to Pavlovsk. And also it was another epoch actually. The late 1700s, they didn't used to use all these expensive buildings, elegant sculptures, mirrors, etc. Not a lot of spark. spacious staircase, just a small one. This is the only official entrance vestibule, official hall, also quite a small. Some of them did not have any special meaning. They were not libraries, they were tiny diplomatic royal gifts. They were given by the European kings during their honeymoon trip to Europe. Here, for example, we have 3 French tapestries, 2 representing just chivalry scenes over here, and 1 that represents one of the stories of the subjects of the novel, say, masculine part of the palace. Because as it was quite traditional in European residences, they also did it here in this Palace of Paul. The central rooms, the apartments were also divided into the masculine and the feminine. These are official ones, and still this was considered like more of the emperor. And the next half of the palace, now we will see, was more of his wife Mary. So the emperor's part,
Are these busts of anyone in particular?
Excuse me?
Are these sculptures of any people in particular, or
And this is like parallel to the Roman hall that we saw at the beginning. So this is the second choir, the Greek hall. So actually it was designed to resemble like an ancient Greek temple, although of course it's in a big way stylization. The columns are of natural jasper, and they do not sustain actually the weight of the ceiling like in ancient Greece the columns were. Was commissioned the building the palace. He had to do everything. He had to complete all the design of the parquet. That's why on the walls here we have like girly stuff, as I can say so, flowers, fruits, musical instruments, nothing of the nothing reminding us of the war. On the eagle we have a peacock, who in the 18th century was considered to be the symbol of happy spousal life, strong spousal ties, and it's inside a In the early 19th century, there was a fire in the palace. Fires at those times were quite a regular thing. He left it very simple, like you could have seen. But here they did restore the floors of before the fire. So these are, although these are not Renaissance time, this is post-war restoration. So let's say this is the third restoration of the original floor. This is a small interior. Also just for visits, some conversations, short conversations between the entrance and the visitants. It is called boudoir. The boudoirs were often made in the feminine parts of the palaces. Boudoir is a guys, maybe you stick together a little bit to let the rest of the together. Thank you. Because it's really, really very tiny. So boudoirs were only made in the feminine parts of the palaces. And here we have beautiful paintings on the ceilings imitating Italian Renaissance. And you see very beautiful pilasters too for visits, for conversations, for ostentation. To show the visitors they really could afford that luxury, although even they themselves never used it in their everyday life. As I told you, in Pavlovsk Palace, the same in the ground floor, in tinier apartments, simpler decorated. So this was just a show off. Anyway, here we have original furnitures. I mean, not the cloths. The cloths are post-war, of course. But the wood, the timber construction, happily survived because it was hidden in the basements of the palace. It was commissioned by Paul for his wife to a very famous French furniture maker. And the views of the views of the Paul's Park. And to the right, there's a very interesting example of actually it's all steel. It was made near Moscow in the famous town of Tula, where since 16th century they had if you look to your left here in the corner you see a cupboard with porcelain cups that were of imperial use. Here. In the next small room there's a beautiful marble sculpture of small boy with an eagle, and to the left is a very interesting clock that shows the hours, the minutes and the seconds, and above there's like an additional luminal disc that shows the phases of the moon, the signs of and as I told you, when the Emperor Paul became the emperor, they added to the menu of the rooms. One was the library, gallery that's much smaller. In one of these small rooms, and then they constructed a fake brick wall in the place of the entrance into the independently where you stay. So now we are
the grouping.
There's two of them. Walking on the water. Jesus Christ, is that you?
They're probably used to like people coming over to feed them. Lots of nature scenes, not like on here. Remember out at Peter House, right?
The best episode of any TV show ever. That's true. No one will ever know.
вечера я купил Кока-кола. О, класс. Это, вау, это, это, интересный. И обычно вода, потому что Питер очень жаркая иногда и холодно иногда. Я пил мало, потому что это очень как алкоголь. Но я очень люблю кок. Очень люблю кок. Очень люблю кок.